Greetings. This is Bill Hall again. We're talking about the Bonhoeffer show and the special series we're doing on Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And this particular episode is called The High Cost of Non Discipleship. Now, Bonhoeffer's book and his life is really about the cost of discipleship. That's what we associate him with. But the high cost of non discipleship is not talked about that often. Here's what Dallas Willard, the late philosopher, said, and I think it really speaks to this. Why the Christian life has failed to transform the masses and make a more just and peaceful world is because it has failed to transform the human character, because it most often is not accompanied by discipleship in philosophy, program, or curriculum. Another way of putting it, the high cost of non-discipleship. It costs us a lot. The cost of discipleship is something that we all need to come to terms with. Jesus talked about that in Luke chapter 9, Luke chapter 14. But the cost of non-discipleship is what we experience right now in our culture. Why our churches are not making new disciples, not many new disciples, not any new disciples, not new disciples who make other disciples. That's just not happening, except maybe in around 5% of churches in America. Now, we all make disciples, but we're not talking about just bad disciples. We're not talking about slacker disciples. We're talking about the kind that reproduce the cause of Christ and engage in mission. Yeah, that's what we're talking about. So we hope that this episode will stir you up and spin you around and put you in the correct direction if you're not already there, okay? So enjoy the episode.
Welcome to the Bonhoeffer Show with Bill Hull and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Wait, I thought Bonhoeffer was dead. Who is Bill Hull? He doesn't sprechen Sie Deutsch, and he doesn't even like sauerkraut. Okay, this is Steve Simmons, and Bill paid me to say this. Bill Hull is tall, good-looking, well-dressed, and smells pretty good. He's written over 30 books. Not one of them is about Bonhoeffer. He went to Bonhoeffer's home in Berlin, and the woman in the front yard wouldn't let him in. He did lecture on Bonhoeffer at Oxford University. They eventually asked him who he was, and he was promptly thrown out. But ladies and gentlemen, and all the others listening to this podcast, here he is anyway. The husband of Jane, a father, a grandfather, Bill Hull.
Well, thank you, Steve Simmons. Not many people know that I'm a novelist.
I know that.
So 29 out of my 30 books. And we're still counting because we're continuing to put together stuff. And it's interesting that one of them's called The Disciple, and it's a novel, and it's an interesting novel. It's available on Amazon. You can read about a pastor who goes on a month sabbatical and kills 9 people. So it's great therapy. It's a way to really work out. It's a very cathartic book, and so you might want to enjoy that. It's a good read. It's really entertaining. You'll laugh a lot. I know my wife did, especially at the syntax. Anyway, hello, folks. We're continuing to do a series on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, how appropriate. But he is our inspiration. We've learned a lot from him. And I want to talk about the high cost of non-discipleship, because we just got finished with a program called The Cost of Discipleship about Bonhoeffer's book. But now we need to talk about the flip side of things. What if you don't do it? What if you say, nah, I don't think I want to do that? So hot off the press is research from the Barna Group that says the share of practicing Christians in the United States has nearly dropped in half in the last 2 decades. Just 25% of Americans are practicing Christians, compared to 45% in the year 2000. Now, I interrupt this research to say, if 45% were practicing Christians in 2000, come on, let's think about this, ladies and gentlemen. 45% of people were practicing Christians in 2000, why did we decline nearly half in 20 years? Is that the fruit of practicing Christianity? That we lose half? If half of America were practicing Christians, game, set, match, break out the party hats. Until you discover how the survey defines a practicing Christian. Someone who identifies as a Christian, that sounds like awful postmodern, doesn't it? If you identify as something, we have people identifying themselves in a number of ways that are quite interesting these days. But it says, someone who identifies as a Christian agrees strongly that faith is very important in their lives, and it's so important they've attended church once in the last month. And people wonder why we're in decline. Only about half as many people go to church, except in the evangelical church, where the decline is seen, but it's meager compared to the church-wide. So this research has a lot to do with the questions that are asked, the kind of people they ask it to, which group they're surveying 20 years ago and which group they're surveying now, the different culture in which we live. But essentially also, when they do these surveys among evangelical Christians, they find that church attendance is a little bit better. But interestingly enough, the lifestyle isn't really any better with respect to morality. Those who identify as non-practicing Christians have doubled. The survey confirms that lukewarm, tepid Christianity will eventually collapse in our increasing secular culture. It's just not going to stand up to the case. In other words, it'll be assimilated into the culture, but this is where it dissipates into. This is where former people who are practicing Christians, where they disappear into the culture, into the gloaming, so to speak. Active Christianity has declined just as our culture elites have managed the gradual decline of our country in the last 20 years. This is one of the interesting things, too, is that how a country and a church can get used to decline. Listen to the late philosopher and writer Dallas Willard. Why the Christian faith has failed to transform the masses. Now, I think without question, that is true. Why the Christian faith has failed to transform the masses and make a more just and peaceful world is because it's failed to transform the human character. This is what's wrong with our Christianity. It's what's wrong with our gospel. It's the high cost of non-discipleship. The cost of discipleship is meager compared to the cost of non-discipleship because it doesn't change human character, because it most often is not accompanied by discipleship in philosophy. In other words, what the creed of the church is, what the understanding of its leadership are, and which relates to, the second thing, program, and the third thing, curriculum. So in philosophy, program, or curriculum. Philosophy is what you believe. That would basically be for the church, the scriptures. Secondly, program, the way you attempt to work out your beliefs in an organized way for people in a congregation or a group. And then curriculum, which is a pathway. It's Latin for race course. So curriculum is more than materials. Curriculum is the way of life. In other words, let's say we have small groups every Tuesday night, but what do we do in those small groups? That's the curriculum. What are we trying to get people to do? That's the curriculum. What is the result we're looking for? That's the curriculum. Another way of putting all this is the high cost of non-discipleship. So let's go back. The Christian faith has failed to transform the masses because it's failed to transform the human character, because it's failed to include discipleship as the central part of what it means to be saved. You know, many years ago, I was sitting at a lunch counter in Indianapolis with a high school friend, and we were discussing our faith. He identified as a non-practicing Christian. I looked at him and I said, I don't think that really exists. Not really what the Bible says. The Bible doesn't really say. Hey, we have a category we're recommending. It's called non-practicing Christian. At least in the mind of Jesus, it only exists in the non-existent category like, have you ever heard a person say, I'm a non-practicing husband? Or I'm a non-practicing father? It does happen, but it's a non-category category. That is what I think of the 20% self-assignment from practicing Christians to the non-practicing category. Even though it is unlikely in the 20 years that have passed to be composed of the same people, the study is not about the original group, but an entirely different set of people who have been taught by a different culture, who have been living with a different narrative, who are living in a different world. In 1937, Dietrich Bonhoeffer gave the world his book, The Cost of Discipleship. Dallas Willard called it a masterful attack on easy Christianity. That's why it's popular, because it is such a wonderful work and such a on-target attack on easy Christianity, which I don't know anybody actually ever came out for. So you can attack Christianity, you can attack easy Christianity, and nobody's going to say foul. No, only if you say your life, your practice, or your church, your specific church. Or as we have discussed earlier, cheap grace. But the book did not succeed in setting aside. Now, this is interesting insight from Willard. But the book did not succeed in setting aside reinforced the view of discipleship as a costly spiritual excess. You see, this is really what Willard was getting at. And it's what we're trying to get at as well, is that disciple-making or discipleship is not just for the elites. It's not just for the missionaries, the monks, and the ministers. It's not just for the super serious. No, it's for everyone because it's part of the gospel. It's not an add-on. It's not an extra. And it's only for those who are especially driven to it or called to it, like Willard says. But the cost of non-discipleship is far greater. I will contend that the American church is reaping what she has sown. And God is not mocked. What we sow, we do reap. We are reaping the bitter harvest of decline and irrelevancy. What have we lost? Well, Willard answers this for us as well. Quote, non-discipleship costs abiding peace, a life penetrated throughout by love, faith, that's seeing everything in the light of God's overriding governance for good. Hopefulness that stands firm in the most discouraging of circumstances, power to do what is right and withstand the forces of evil. In short, non-discipleship costs you exactly that abundance of life that Jesus said he came to bring. Close quote. Now, just let me give you John 10:10 for the record. The thief's purpose is to steal and kill and destroy. Now, if you wanted to steal, kill, and destroy the vibrancy of the church, of people's faith, what would you do? What you do is not a frontal attack. What you would do is you'd alter the theology, you would alter the story, water it down, and make it ineffective. But Jesus said, my purpose is to give them a rich and satisfying life. Now, we have detailed a lot of our losses here, how we have reaped what we have sown, the loss of peace, love, confidence in God, the power to get through the challenges of life, and the general sense of joy and satisfaction. And after the break, we're going to dig deeper into how we get out of this decline, and we're going to do so with my co-host and compadre and comrade, if you like, Brandon Cook.
The Bonhoeffer Show is brought to you by the Bonhoeffer Project. As Bill said, the Bonhoeffer Project turns leaders into disciple makers. Jesus calls us as his disciples to make more disciples. But why should we make disciples? What are disciples? How does one make disciples? And who should join us? If you are interested in accomplishing what you agreed to do when you decided to follow Jesus, then inquire at thebonhoefferproject.com. You may qualify to become a member of one of our cohorts. The Bonhoeffer Project has cohorts spread across the U.S. and in several countries of the world. And remember to subscribe to The Bonhoeffer Show by going to the website, thebonhoefferproject.com. There you'll see the Bonhoeffer Show button. Click it and subscribe. Or go to iTunes, then type in The Bonhoeffer Show. And now, back to you, Bill.
Thank you, Steve. Dr. Rufus Jones. Never met him. He actually died 2 years after I was born in 1948. And certainly you've not met him since you were born in 1980.
That is correct.
So he was a writer and scholar. He had an MBA or some kind of graduate degree from Harvard. He spoke about how little the impact the 20th century evangelical church had on societal problems. Now, I think his diagnosis was inadequate, but it probably was right on in the first half of the 20th century, because that was when the social gospel, Walter Rauschenbusch and others were famous, became famous for the social gospel. And at that time, he lived in both worlds. He had one leg in the church, 1 foot in the church, and 1 foot, I think, in the larger world. And he was very much a part of the social concern movement. But I would say any natural disaster these days around the world finds conservative Christians in the forefront. The evangelicals are there first. They are their best and in greater numbers. I think the evidence of this is overwhelming. But I think the problem is much deeper. I think we can find something around which liberals and conservatives have in common. And here's what they agree on. Discipleship to Christ is optional to membership in the church. This is because, and neither one of them, whether they're social justice warriors or they are private Christianity warriors, we don't get at character. And this continues to be what Willard is telling us. We failed to transform human character. Now, here's the question I have for you, Brandon, and it's not just a regular kind of question. It creates some issues, and both our pastoral experiences, between the two of us, we have well over 30 years of experience as pastors. Why don't churches require evidence of discipleship to Jesus by Jesus' standard for membership in the local church? Now, I'm talking about membership now. Why do you think we don't do that?
Well, it's a big question. I think, number one, just on a human level, every human gravitates towards comfort, towards the path of least resistance.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I think our churches are set up in a similar vein to be the path of least resistance. So you have just a human level to it. Secondly, our scorecard, what we deem success. We have the pride of life, less of the flesh, less of the eyes, the pride of life. The Scripture warns us about, and I think the lust of the eyes and the pride of life in this scenario would be the scorecard we've created for the church. A successful church looks a certain way, has a certain amount of people, attending in certain contexts, has certain big buildings, has a certain budget. And you can very easily grow a large church of that sort without having to call people to their formation. In other words, you can grow an organization without actually having to call people to their formation meaning them taking on the life of Christ. So why would you, or having Christ formed within them, why would you do the former when you can do the latter? When you can have a successful church, why would you call them to their formation? Oftentimes, financiers are involved here. There's people who are highly incentivized to keep their jobs, to have their medical plans, to have their 403B benefits. So you have staff that are driving, that don't want to rock the boat because they're very happy with how it's set up, that people are happy with church, they give money, and why would you want to mess with that? So that setup pretty much precludes any sort of demand of you. In other words, you want a low bar to get as many people in the door and as many people giving. A high bar would dissuade people. This is what's so remarkable about Jesus in John 6, is he says, he's got a crowd following him, and he says, eat my flesh, drink my blood. He says something that he knows will be provocatively offensive. He sees who can handle it, who's willing to step over the high bar that he sets. And, any church growth advisor would have told him he was crazy at that point. So those are two reasons, I think: our own human love of comfort and our love of a scorecard by which we can measure success that doesn't cost us our comfort.
It's hard to swim against the stream here. I mean, You think about it. There's a book I've read called...
Well, if you do swim against the streams, they'll just go to a different church, right? That's part of it.
There's a book I've read by a good friend of mine, Larry Osborne, called Accidental Pharisees. It's actually a very good book. And in this book, he has ways in which he says that discipleship theory or teaching has been really damaging to the church, and that we became accidentally like Pharisees. In other words, we thinned the herd. Now, what he's saying is, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but what he really is saying is that by requiring things like membership, that there's evidence of faith in your life, that you're thinning the herd. And by you're thinning the herd, you are telling certain people, you're breaking them down into classifications of Christians and levels of Christians, and it doesn't really work very well. Now, it certainly doesn't work very well if you do it with a certain attitude. But if you do it in the way that people aspire to something rather than they're eliminated from something, I think it makes a huge difference.
Sure.
So I'm talking about aspiration here, is that the vision, the preaching, the calling, if it's done properly, calling people to a higher life, to a better life, a greater life, the life of Christ, is aspirational and positive, and I think people would reach for it. If you say, well, unless you do these things, and if you're doing these other things, you're out, that's not good. But I think it's just like people aspire to be members of a club. People aspire to become members of some association, or they want to be on the varsity rather than the junior varsity, whatever it happens to be. It's a very human thing. But I think that there's been times in the church where a church has thinned the herd. However, I'm not talking about that, like being cultic. What I'm talking about is that there have been positive ways in which churches have delayed membership. They say, for example, we want you to be a practicing Christian for 6 months before we baptize you. We'd like for you to be in our church for 1 year and be interviewed before you become a member. We'd like to school you, disciple you, and prepare you for membership in our church. Now, to me, these would be positive developments. But why is it we don't want to do it? Because it brings our numbers down, because it doesn't look as good, because we can't build the narrative we want. We can't be as successful as we want. We can't be like the big boys down in the corner. And so that's what's swimming upstream. That's pushing the rock up the hill. That's the hard part. I think that's one of the reasons we do it. But have you, in your own pastoral life, how was it that you taught aspirational? What could people aspire to? What could people reach for?
Mm-hmm. A lot of it was changing the language away from being a Christian into learning to live and love like Jesus, and changing the theology of going to heaven to the theology of heaven's going here, and that you can participate in that. I think it's a call to participation. It's a call to meaning in the midst of a seeming... I think one of the things that's happening in society right now is there's a total dearth of narratives of meaning. There's an epidemic of suicide among young men, especially young white men. Their race being significant because in this demographic, generally speaking, facing higher levels of comfort than other demographics, and yet among this more comfortable demographic, an epidemic of suicide, which tells you that there's a lack of meaning, that comfort doesn't provide a compelling narrative of meaning. And in society right now, I think that's a major growing problem is, what do we live for? Okay, we're comfortable. We have iPhones. We have technology that kind of insinuates us into this situation of passivity, of comfort, of even idleness, but we're not fulfilled. And so in the church, I think it's a matter of, hey, it's a matter of revealing the truth of, if you want a meaningful life, then learn to live for others, love your neighbor as yourself, love God with everything you have. You can live a highly fulfilled life of love, of generosity, of compassion in the midst of a world that's often dark. And I think that's a very different message than pray this prayer so you can go to heaven when you die.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's changing theological narratives. It's changing the language of a church's culture, but that's a long build. That's some slow work.
It's a generational thing.
Yeah. Yes.
You know, recently, speaking of suicide, the suicide rate has been going up dangerously on the rise in the last few years. And opioid use has been a big problem. And like you say, among people of good economic standing, of high economic standing. But the last year, it dropped for the first time in like 7 or 8 years. But it's still a serious problem. My good friend Jim Putman, pastor of Real Life Ministries up in Post Falls, Idaho, I was with him this last week in Orlando, and he was telling us a story about the suicide rate in Idaho, and suicide rate in that area, the Coeur d'Alene, Post Falls area, is very, very high, alarmingly high, and such that the school is concerned about it. And what it came to a head recently when the star quarterback and straight A student and president of his class committed suicide.
Really?
And the city was dumbfounded. So Jim calls the superintendent of schools. And what happens is that the schools have opened up themselves to the church, and they said, you can make a film that can instruct everybody about this issue and they studied this. And that they were going to make 2 versions of the film, one for Christians, one for the church, and one for the school, and for schools all over the state of Idaho. And a remarkable breakthrough that they would allow the church to actually head up this project. But they needed like $150,000, $175,000. And so Jim gets this call from a guy that's a billionaire, but he hasn't talked to in years.
He calls him, or he gets a call?
He just calls the guy. The guy calls him. The guy calls, out of the blue, he calls Jim Putman.
Okay.
And he asks Jim, I don't know why I should call you today, but it seemed like God was impressing me to call you. What do you need?
Wow.
He said, I need $175,000. He said, good, you got it. And I like that story so much. It's not only, it's true. It's present tense, and it really deals with the problem. And I'm really thinking that if pastors will step into the breach, and they have credibility, because Jim's been there for 20 years, and he has credibility in that community, that's the impact that the church can have.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we have other questions here that I'd like to explore. Bonhoeffer and Willie were similar in wanting to have the church practice their faith to be real and authentic. Germany came from a very liberal theological base, and the church failed Germany, especially in that critical moment of where Adolf Hitler was able to get elected and then become not only chancellor, but then president, and then take over the government. And American Christianity has a strong conservative base, but we've lost the cultural elites. And whereas today, the main institutions that represent our culture, many of them are controlled by the cultural elites, which is a very secular narrative. And so the question I have is, what's the best strategy for the church and for Christians in the culture we're in right now?
Do justice, love mercy, walk humbly with your God.
That's pretty good advice.
I mean,
right out of Micah, right?
Yeah. So, to be, look, I think the idea of doing justice here on this earth, justice in Hebrew having this connotation of things being in right relationship, connects to the Hebrew idea of shalom, of things being in more than peace, but in flourishing. I think, number one, we got to work on our theology still. We thought that we were a people who were going to heaven, and the message is that heaven's coming here. And the question is, will you be the kind of person who can bear the flames of the glory of God? Because it burns away everything that is false. And so if you're a Christian, but you haven't built in Christ-like character, all that's going to be revealed. So there's a theological Dallas Willard says the flames of heaven are way hotter than the fires of hell. And maybe they're the same flames, and they're just experienced differently by different people. There's a theological shift that has to happen. Heaven's coming here, where we teach people that they can partake in the justice, the wholeness, the flourishing of the kingdom of God. The humility piece is that whenever Christians do what the Pharisees did, which is use religion to be right and use it as the thing that actually shields us from God, people rightly sniff out the hypocrisy. So what can Christians do? Well, walk humbly, listen, be curious in the midst of an uncivil culture, be a people of listening, curiosity, be a people of compassion, of service, care for people who are different than you, listen to their stories. The church could actually become the invite into caring, civil, loving discourse. Could actually become a diverse community, socioeconomically, racially, could become a place that shows that when Jesus said in John 13, the world's going to know you're my disciples by how you love one another, we could actually do that and become an emblem of what it means to be countercultural in a culture that is becoming increasingly uncivil. So justice and humility are the first two, justice and mercy on one hand, and humility on the other are the first two things that come to mind for me. What about you?
Well, I would agree with that. I also think that somehow we need to continue to do like what we do in the Bonhoeffer Project, is we work with leaders to transform them into disciple makers. And that begins, but it has to be life on life. It has to be personal. It has to be into their DNA. And that's what makes the difference. And if we can get a few people, it doesn't have to be a lot, but just a few people who really are passionate and who are leaders, who can multiply their lives in others because they really care about it, because there's nothing, they've repented, they've come to the point where they realize that not making disciples as a central part of their ministry is a sin, a grievous sin before God that need to be repented of. I really believe that's fundamentally where we need to be. Well, we're going to have to take a break now and hear more from our friend Steve Simmons, and we'll be back with the best and the worst of the past week or so.
If you want to go deeper into Bill's and the Bonhoeffer's teachings, go to www.thebonhoefferproject.com. There you'll find videos, books, and other resources that present both the problem and the solution to the disciple-making challenge facing today's Christian community. You can join a cohort or read Bill's and other Bonhoeffer Project team members' blogs and connect to Bill's books and articles. Remember to subscribe to The Bonhoeffer Show. Go to iTunes and do it today. We need to hear from you so Bill can answer your questions. All of Bill's answers are guaranteed to make you better looking. Lose 10 pounds. And the IRS to write you a very big refund check. Well, not really, but you get the idea. Now, back to the King of Culture for critical analysis of whatever crosses his mind. Take it away, Bill.
You know, that losing 10 pounds thing, I think that probably if you lost 5 and I lost 5,
I'll take it.
We probably have to run around the shower just to get wet.
I don't know. I don't know. I'm doing the cook thing, which is past age 35. I'm starting to.
Oh, is that a family trait?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
A little bit. I think I'm trying to hide it well.
Well, yeah. Wear a lot of sweatshirts. That only works for a while. All right. The best and the worst of the week, last week or so. So you get to go first.
Oh, I get to go first? I was going to carry them off you.
No, I want an honest best or worst. Come on. Best,
okay,
worst.
the best, the worst is people buying all the toilet paper from Costco.
Why are they fighting over that?
I don't know. I guess to fight coronavirus, we need to feel like we're doing something.
Yeah.
So that would be my worst. My bet. Now you do one so I can think.
Well, I think that my best this past week was being in Orlando with the Disciple Making First family from around the country, and just listening to what God is doing around the world and around our country. That was very encouraging. Also, coming to terms with, again, this issue of prayer and fasting and its role in our country. And I think that what they've discovered is that we don't want prayer and fasting just to be another church growth tool. And it turns out that we Americans are really talented at this. We take things that God meant for something else, and we try to turn them into something that will make us feel better about ourselves and our work and build our egos. So essentially what I'm thinking is that they found in all of these disciple-making movements around the world that people happen to be praying and fasting. But this would go on for years before anything would happen, before any fruit was born. Yeah. And this is what we don't hear, and this is what Christians in America we just can't stand it, that we would have to pray, that we would have to
deprive
ourselves of things for a long period of time with no evidence that it was making any bit of difference. In fact, things might get worse, but what they have found is, and I don't want to teach this as a cause and effect, but I think it's the desperation that we feel. It's that when people get desperate, when they are motivated by God, that one of the things they start doing is praying more and fasting some. As part, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a full denial of food fast, but it can be various things, like a media fast would just frazzle people. Just turn off the television, don't use your electronics for a day or two. That would be remarkable. I've done these, and listen, they're the hardest fast I've ever been on. So that would be my best of the week.
Yeah, my best of the week, all right, would be, it's very more personal than it is global, but the rain in Southern California has created incredible sunsets. I went down to Seal Beach and saw, which is near Long Beach, and sunset was stunning. And to me, that's a reminder that all's going to be well. And, it's like that cliche. Everything will be okay in the end. If it's not okay, it's not the end. I think nature is constantly speaking to us this reality of some internal truth about God. As Paul would say it, his eternal power and Godhead revealed in nature. So,
have been clearly seen
by what's been revealed in nature. Yeah. So, I think in Southern California right now, which is not known for its nature, perhaps, the nature is always finds a way to speak. Nature finds a way to speak. So that's been an encouragement to me, and it's a reminder to get out there and consider the lilies of the field wherever you are.
Yes, very good. Well, the worst of the week for me, I don't know. I think probably just being reminded of how we are in decline in the church. But I saw the parts of the church that are extremely healthy, and that was encouraging. But just to continue the fight. And ladies and gentlemen, we ask you to join us in this fight. Join us in this cause. It's aspirational. It's not negative. It's positive. Because we serve a great and mighty God. And his arm is not too short. So until next time, follow Jesus, and he will teach you everything you'll ever need to know.
Well, we hope that the show wasn't too bad. Jane Hull wants everyone to know that if anything Bill said was offensive, she feels your pain. If you were upset by anything Bill and his guests said, well, mission accomplished. At the Bonhoeffer Show, we value irreverent, satirical, and generally inappropriate behavior. But when it comes to fulfilling the Great Commission, we don't mess around. Remember, subscribe. We promise. No private jets, no white suits, and definitely no toupees.